There's real tension, sometimes real anger, I find in my comment section between the Bantu, Yoruba, and Igbo communities over one of the main questions about who sold who into slavery. And it's not just a rumor or an innuendo or a little thing, it's a huge issue, I think. And it's a wound that people still carry, even though this trade stopped a couple hundred years ago or more. But it's still there, this wound. And I don't really want in this video, I don't want to dance around it. Like I like to go head on, so I'm going to go head on into this issue and not try to soften it in any way. But before we go to that issue, I really think we need to deal with another family that lived through pretty much exactly the same thing, I think, 3,000 years before any of this happened over in West Africa. We're dealing with 12 brothers. You know the story in the Bible, Joseph being sold into Egypt. So 3 different mothers, yes, but the same father. So they were his brothers or half-brothers, if you like. But they sold him into slavery. Joseph we're talking about, and Benjamin wasn't around at the time. But they sold their brother into slavery. And it wasn't just somebody, it was their own blood family. And as you know in my videos, I've gone into that the Yoruba and the Igbo and the Bantu and all the peoples in sub-Saharan Africa, using that term using that colonial term. But those people, if you go back far enough, they come from a common language, a common ancestors. Yes, there's been breaks, and of course there are different peoples, thousands of different languages and peoples in Africa. But the issue isn't that. The issue is that they sold their own blood relations into slavery. So of course we know his story with Joseph being sold into Egypt and all of that. But the story has some real key things I want to bring into this before I deal with each specific Bantu, Igbo, and Yoruba group and get into the history and the facts of the matter. But this Joseph, I think we look at him honestly and what happened with that family, we can draw some really interesting characteristics from that. We see after the whole story, and we know the slavery and into the pit, and his brother sold him, and these years and years, we have no idea, maybe 20 years, long time, so before his mother dies while he's in prison. But yet, in the end, Heavenly Father, or God, or whatever you want to call him, Abba, he then restores Joseph out of the prison and then makes him, as we know, second in command. But when Joseph meets his brothers, we see this key thing that he said, "Ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good." So if we think about that as we go through this, think about that issue. Yes, there were terrible things done to people, to their families, by many different groups, of course. Not even talking about the colonial powers and the different groups that were there, the Spaniards and the English and the Portuguese and all the different groups and what they've done. But we're talking about family to family. What happened within Africa, that the slaves got put on those ships, because it wasn't just like with Joseph, it was the Midianites that actually took him to Egypt. But it wasn't the Midianites that sold him into slavery. It was his own family and blood. And I want to put this quite clearly, the Igbo, Yoruba, and Bantu peoples, and the other peoples in Africa. These many distinct peoples, they have their own oral history. They have their own way of seeing what happened with slavery and other things as well. But the historical record of the transatlantic slave, we'll find, and I'm going to show, that there are actually members of all 3 of these groups in the Americas, the Yoruba, the Bantu, and the Igbo. If it was just the Igbo that were in the Americas, we could go, okay, well, that's interesting. But it's all 3 groups. And I think not all at the same time exactly, but there's all 3 groups there. And especially for my American viewers that watch, to understand where do they come from, how did that happen. I know it's so confusing, and I feel bad, but it's so confusing because of what happened to those families. It's hard to trace anything back. But I know I have had viewers from the Americas that say they have Igbo and they have Bantu, or they have a mixture of this and that's normal when there's been a mixing of populations. So the historical record is on both sides of the Atlantic, both sides of the transatlantic slave trade, and not just in the US, but in Brazil, in the islands of the Caribbean, all through the Americas, and even further. We find members of all three of these groups, the Yoruba, Bantu, and Igbo peoples, not just among the enslaved we're going to see, but also among those who took part in the actual selling of the slaves. Different times, different peoples, but we'll deal with that in a second. So here's my question, and I want to ask it directly to my viewers. If these three people really are connected to the sons of Jacob, okay, so they really are Israel, or, in my opinion, more likely they're all part of Shem, or Hebrew, or Eber, then are we not looking at the same family, the same three wives or three groups played out in the sort of the same kind of story? Larger scale, yes, but brother or cousin or relation against relation, even if there's thousands of years apart. I think we need to be really frank. There is a lot of hurt and a lot of terrible things that happened, and they haven't even been rectified, most things, of course. But I do want us to think about this. There was truly a huge slave trade. There were terrible things done, and it touched the Bantu, the Yoruba, and the Igbo peoples, specifically, differently in some ways, but specifically. And I want to dig in, I'm going to dig into each one of them individually and show the whole issue within their own group and as it affects the others as well. Not because there's a need to blame. And I think when we look at Joseph, when he got back with his brothers, could he even speak? No, he couldn't hardly speak. He wept. He couldn't. The hurt was great, no doubt about it. But in the end, there was reconciliation. Maybe not friendship ever, but there was reconciliation. There was healing to a degree. And the healing, I think, comes from understanding. And I hope that this video will help you to understand your own group and between the groups a little bit more. Because I know it's very hard. I know if I took Joseph's perspective, before he met his brothers, he would be bitter and angry and hatred. And I think if he took the brothers, they were bitter and hatred and angry at Joseph for his bragging or whatever you want to call it as well. So it isn't like a clean sheet that one person was completely innocent, nothing ever caused the problem, and that doesn't really matter. So it doesn't get into blame, but it does get into, can we heal? Can we come to understanding? And ultimately, can a family be healed even slightly through understanding and through grace, the same grace that Joseph offered his brothers when he said, look what God has done with this. And when I see these people online from the Americas especially, and they go, yeah, I've got Bantu and Igbo blood, or I've got Yoruba and Igbo blood, or I've got Bantu, or I've got whatever. It's interesting because then you see there's a greater thing that happened. There is a greater purpose going on than I think what we can see. And I also don't want to say that Joseph's brothers were justified in their treatment of Joseph. Not at all. I don't want to go there either. So I don't want us to think that, oh no, we can never know who did this and who did that and what happened here and who those people were that took the people across in the ships and which groups they were from in Europe and all that. No, of course we can go study all that. I don't want to even soften that slightly. And I also don't want to get to where it's each group was selling off each group and, so it's all justified. I don't want to go there either, because what happened with one group to Joseph was one group to Joseph. And we can't make light of that either. And we also see that it's just not that clean even in the Genesis story. We see that Reuben, right, even though Reuben wasn't perfect with the things that happened with Bilhah and all that kind of stuff, but Reuben was trying to save his brother. It wasn't like all of them were all together, and no, Reuben was trying and he convinced them. And then Judah kind of stepped in too, but the reality was it was Reuben that was actually the best of them, not Judah, not the others. It was Reuben, maybe for what he'd already suffered, who knows. But it was Reuben that stood up and said, don't do this thing. And he was terrified of what happened in the end. And to his credit, to his wonderful credit, he stood up against his brothers. That's not always easy to do. But remember, when we come to this story, the slave trade was already happening. The Midianites were already coming through. It wasn't like this never happened, but it generally happened in the ancient times. It was the conquering people that sold the conquered people into slavery. It wasn't always or very often that it was the actual family selling their brother into slavery. And I think we go through these, I'm going to go through each of them, like I said, the Bantu, the Igbo, and the Yoruba, and show the Reuben type behavior, and also the Judah Simeon type behavior, and in between. And I think it helps to understand the Joseph side of things so much better, and to come to some kind of, reconciliation, or at least understanding of what happened at the time. So we know with this family, they had 3 different mothers, right? And we know that Leah was actually the wife, and the other sons were from handmaids that sold Joseph. And I already mentioned about Reuben, the firstborn, who had his failings. But we see Judah. Did Judah stand up for Joseph? Not really. He just said, hey, instead of killing him, let's sell him into slavery. So he came up with the plan. It was better than killing him, I guess, but it wasn't much better, really. It certainly wasn't Reuben's idea of, let's just get him back to his house. So as we fast forward, let's say for Joseph, it was 20, 30, 40 years, anyway, it was some period of time. But if it was for the transatlantic slave trade, it was quite a long time, and it was quite a long time ago. Now we're sitting in 2026, time when I'm doing the video, and yet these fires still kindles, they still burn just as much, I suppose, in some ways, as when Joseph met his brothers for the first time. So when the brothers go into Egypt, do you think that they actually thought their brother was going to be there? No, they must have wondered what happened to him, right? They probably thought he was dead, or who knows, right? They'd have no idea. So they had no concept when they're standing in front of their brother that it was their brother. That just wouldn't have crossed their mind at all, right? But Joseph then reveals himself in the end, after all the little games that he played, to see what their hearts were like when he played around with Benjamin and all that. We know the story. But he says the words that, again, I want to reiterate here. Ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Now, when the brothers threw him in that pit and then sold him, did they know that? Of course not, nor did Joseph. The only person that knew was Father in heaven, and he in the end brought it to pass. But was it easy? Not for Joseph. And I don't think easy for the brothers, because they lived with that guilt all their lives. They couldn't be honest with their father. They couldn't be honest with one another. They always knew that this wicked deed that they'd done was, I'm sure, disturbing their soul, like it is for any of us when we make mistakes. So remember these 3 things. There was a brother that tried to protect him. He failed because of the circumstances, but he did try to protect him. A brother whose plan actually got carried out, and a trade route that was already there. Those 3 things, as we go into the transatlantic slavery, and these three people, or your 3 people, I think try to keep those things in mind. They're all separate, but they're all woven together. And I think they come across, you'll see it in the Atlantic trade as well. I'll start with this historical fact, because I want to put it plainly in front of us. Genetic and historic research shows that all 3 groups, the Igbo, the Yoruba, and the Bantu-speaking peoples, particularly out of the Congo and Angola area, are substantially represented among the enslaved Africans brought to the Americas. Igbo and Yoruba together made up close to 1/3 of all enslaved Africans that were transported across the Atlantic. Bantu-speaking Congo and Angola supplied a huge share of the Portuguese-Brazilian trade route specifically. Okay, because these happened at different times, of course, too, right? So it isn't just one people. We're going to discuss all 3 groups and what happened as best I can with all 3 groups. And the historical record, I want to make this clear, shows members of all 3 lines appearing. Not all of all 3 lines, but parts of all 3 lines, the Bantu, Yoruba, and Igbo peoples, selling people in Africa into captivity and into slavery, in the transatlantic slavery. Not all at the same time, but all 3 groups had parts of their group that sold other peoples into the transatlantic slave. And I think that's probably why we see Bantu, Igbo, and Yoruba peoples in the Americas. I don't mean that they all came exactly at the same time, but they're all there represented. So if you're an Igbo person watching this now, or if you're Yoruba or Bantu, anywhere in what we call, as I said, the sub-Saharan Africa, using that colonial term, If we want to understand, it is family through linguistics studies and family through DNA studies as well. And even if we look at the Bible with the many different tribes and peoples, yes, still family. Just as Esau was family with Jacob, or Ishmael was family with Isaac. It's family. Not perfect family, of course, but it is family. And I think that helps. And as we discuss this, we're going to have a Reuben group and we're going to have a Judah type group. Okay, two different groups, how things were handled in two different ways. And Judah, of course, would include the rest of his brothers that went along with what he was doing. And Reuben, I don't know anyone that went with Reuben because he's the only one that actually stood up for Joseph. But there were always within the Bantu, Igbo, and Yoruba people, we're going to find and talk about those that stood up. And we're also going to talk about the Judah types within the same group, not each, in the whole huge group of Bantu or huge group of Igbo or Yoruba, but within there are also parts that did more along the lines of Judah and facilitating the slave trade with the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the other people we dare not name. And I think we can get from the story, at least I do, that the family, it wasn't a clean Reuben, Judah, and everybody else, all the other brothers were this way, and Joseph was that way. No, it wasn't that crystal clear. It was like Reuben was this way. Some of the other brothers were just full of hatred. Judah was as well, but he at least said, let's do slavery instead of killing. But so there's this gamut of where we find people. Nothing's perfect like my own family or anyone else's family. And I think if we understand that, we can start to see maybe past the blinders that we have within the group that we are in. So we can see maybe the other side or the group that and their reasons and rationales. So we're not trying to cast blame, even though there's lots of blame to hand out. I'm after more, how did it happen and how is each family involved in the family dynamics, if we want to call it that, them casting blame and aspersions on just one group. And it's all them and only them, and we were innocent completely. Because I think Joseph himself, if I were to ask him, I believe he would say, as he was older and wiser after what he went through, I don't believe he would have acted the same way with his brothers, with his coat, as he did when he was young. And I think it doesn't mean that he was to blame in a sense, but it's not like things are always so cut and dry. I think if we start to look at the facets of behavior and what happened, I think that'll really help us. Because Joseph did not let the behavior that happened to him define forever his family's future. He saved them, he rescued them, and in the end he protected them. Even though he had all the power in the kingdom, we have to understand, we don't think about it, I don't anyway, that he as the second in command, he could have had all his brothers put to death. He could have put them all back into slavery. He had the opportunity. There was nothing stopping him. And yet he had mercy and kindness and compassion and love. And he healed the wounds, and then they wept on each other's shoulders because the wounds were healed. Not perfectly. I'm not going to say they were perfectly healed, but there was a start. There was at least some reconciliation and some understanding. I don't mean I want you to reconcile yourselves yet with the slavers and the Europeans and what they've done and continue to do, but I'm talking among the African people themselves. I want to talk about this people among the Igbo first, NRI and the ARO people, Niri and Aro people. So starting with the Igbo group as a family itself, outside, not with the others right now. There really was a protector among the Igbo people as well, and it's real and it's actually documented. The kingdom of Niri and the independent Igbo states alongside it actively refused to practice slavery as an institution. And more than that, they actually functioned as a place for refugees to go to, kind of like in the Americas, in the north and into Canada. I'm Canadian, and I know that lots of Africans came to Canada and escaped the slavery in the south in the U.S. But this people among the Igbo, the Niri, they actually acted as a state where anybody could go and seek protection and be away from the slavery. So this Neri people became like the Reuben part of the Igbo family. They completely did not want anything to do with it and had nothing to do with the slavery, and actually protected their brothers. This is a real, as you know, I'm the Gentile talking here, but I'm not trying to make up this history. You can go look it up yourself. It's not invented. It actually happened. There was also a trader. The Otto Confederacy was a specific trading and religious political network within the Igbo community or territory, built around the Ibini Kapai oracle. And I think, to be fair here, remember that the Aro weren't simply driven by profit. There was a defensive dimension here as well that they were trying to defend. They needed the European weapons to counter growing European territorial encroachment, and the trade in captives was part of how they got them. But whatever the mix of motives, no matter what the English and the colonizers were doing, there still was this Judah-type group that were willing to sell others into slavery to get the armaments and the weapons and to protect themselves in a way. So the plan did get carried out the same way as Judah's plan got carried out with Joseph. So two different peoples within the Igbo community acting two different ways towards the slavery question. And please, if you're from the Igbo community and you feel to rebuke me or correct me, I would love it, right? I always love facts on the ground. You know them way better than I do. And there's a lot to be told here, more than I'm able to give. At least consider it, think about it, and please, in the comments, please give me your piece and what happened and your understanding. And I'll try to maybe make a second video if there's enough comments, enough detail there. So remember that the outside caravan, like the Midianites, were the Europeans, this trading network, made up, of course, of many peoples: Britons, Portuguese, Spanish, the Sephardic Jews, the Ashkenazi, the Sephardics, all the different groups were involved in this trade. It was huge, right? It wasn't just Britain or just France. It was a very big colonial power dynamic that was going on at the time. And I will say this as well as I know, and I've traced my history back to the 1600s. I don't have any of that in my family because we were poor families in Canada that came from Britain. So I can't find anything from there, or from Scotland, Ireland, in that area. So, but does that mean that we as Canadians didn't do terrible things to the native peoples? Absolutely. Just look at the schools system, what happened. There's terrible, terrible things. Maybe not as bad as what happened in the States. Certainly there wasn't the slavery in that way. But was it perfectly innocent either? No, I think we're probably more like the Reuben. The Reuben group in the U.S. is probably more like the Judah group, right? But be that as it may, again, that's in the past. It's in the history. Yes, it still affects and has terrible effects even to this day. So this caravan of Europeans really was the bite of Biafra. It's the place where they accounted for the most substantial share of the entire transatlantic slavery on its own came from this Biafra area in Africa, in West Africa. Here's a number that I got. I think it's worth thinking about anyway. It's estimated that roughly 60% of the African Americans have at least one ancestor from the Igbo kingdoms. Okay, it's estimated because that's exactly what it is. But even with an estimate, it tells us how deep this particular thread, how many Igbo were taken away. So when I see Igbos in the comments and they're frustrated, I get it, right? Their group, maybe it was pounced on more than any other group. So again, there's that one group, there's the people that were taken away, there's also the protector group, and the root, all moving in harmony sort of together, just as in the Joseph story. So let's take our canoe and go upriver, or let's take our plane and fly over to Yoruba area. I think with the Yoruba, it gets even maybe more interesting in a different way. There's a long stretch of history. Yoruba communities were largely protected, okay, and not involved so much in this slave trade, not because of a moral refusal to be part of it or to trade in captives the way the Niri was, but through the sheer dominance of their own empire. the Oyo Empire was, for generations, powerful enough that the Yoruba people largely avoided being enslaved themselves. That's a different kind of Reuben scenario than we saw with the Igbo, where the protection was actually by choice. But this is rather protection through strength of their kingdom versus protection because of some moral standing like the Niri had. So in a sense, among their own people, that's a different kind, more like the Reuben thing. They didn't sell their own people into slavery, all right? But at the same time, the Oyo people, they were traders, okay? They were the trading of in slavery people, and it extracted tribute in captives from vassal states, the Iyesa or Uwu and others, as direct instrument of imperial power. And by the mid-1600s, Oyo had become the largest mainland supplier to the slave coast. Okay, so the slave-producing people, okay, the Igbo faced more of the enslavement of their people, yet there was the one group, as I said, that were also enslaving people for their own reasons. But there was also the incredible group that were protecting people as well. But among the Oyo, or the Yoruba group, they had a large kingdom, and among their tributes, they were taking people away into slavery and providing the slave trade with people. So were they Reuben-like, or were they more Judah-like? Well, at first they were more Reuben-like because they protected their own people, but among the people they were more like a mix between the slave traders of the Midianites and the Judah type thing. And here's where it took a turn in the 1800s, and I think it's interesting, the early 1800s, because this people, the Yoruba or the Oyo, who were actually a huge part of the slave trade, they themselves as a kingdom fell apart and collapsed. So under the pressure of the Fulani and the Sokoto Caliphate, internal fragmentation and the rise of Dahomey, and I need to study this more myself, they reversed the entire pattern. And after that collapse, it was the Yoruba people who had been the protected majority. They became the majority of those captured and shipped right up until the end of the slave trade in the 1850s. So the ones that were the slavers became the enslaved. That would be like, let's say, Judah and those people, they were the ones that had enslaved and sent their brothers away. And then when they got to Egypt, if Joseph had then gone and enslaved them and sent them away, that would be more or less in my opinion, sort of like the Oyo Yoruba story here. And again, please, if you're from the Yoruba group, please clarify any details. I love it, right? All the comments against me, for me, or clarifying problems, I love it. And because that's how you get to the truth. It's hearing other people's stories, and you know them way better than I do. And another thing we could think about is Judah's own, as I said with Joseph, that didn't happen under Joseph. But just later after that, Judah's own people, his own kindred, his own family, then became enslaved when the pharaohs changed and they put all of the children of Jacob into slavery. So things did change, and Judah's family went into slavery as well, which is sort of kind of like this happened with this Oyo kingdom. And again, I don't want to diminish the slave trade among the Yoruba either. They were decimated by it in the 1800s. As it said, they became the group with the greatest amount of slaves going out at that time. So what comes around goes around, I suppose. But all the groups, so far we've seen that with the Igbo, yes, there was one great group that was like the Reuben group, but there's also a group that did sell people into slavery. And then we see this different dynamic here among the Yoruba, to where they were doing the selling into slavery until they themselves became the ones that were enslaved. Getting into the Bantu and the Congo story is fascinating because it comes at it in a different way. But yes, there's definitely protection at the beginning, more like the Reuben side of things from the very start. The early kings of the Congo drew an explicit legal line. Freeborn Congo subjects were protected from external sale. Only foreign war captives could be sold into the Atlantic slave trade, and King Afonso I didn't just hold that line quietly, but starting in 1526, he wrote directly to the Portuguese crown, complaining that traders were violating that system. A king who personally trying to hold the line in writing to another king on the other side of the ocean. That is a genuinely striking historical echo of Reuben's private intervention to protect Joseph. But Congo's own civil wars, beginning in the 1670s, broke those protections, the protections they had within their own community, and it broke it down completely. After that point, Congo's own people became vulnerable to capture and sale, the same way Israel later found itself back in bondage in the slavery after the pharaohs changed and the attitudes changed in Egypt. The slaving frontier shifted south into Ngongo and Angola, driven substantially by Imbagala mercenary bands working directly for the Portuguese traders, armed with European guns in exchange for captives. So we can see that this story is so complicated. I had no idea when I dipped my finger into this pool, as they say in John Wick. I had no idea that I'd get bitten by so many facts. I mean, it's just amazing. I guess when you talk hundreds of years of history and peoples and trading, that we're just barely touching the surface. But then we see with the same thing happening here, people that were at first very hesitant, especially about their own people being put into slavery, fine with others to some degree, but not their own people. Then we see that breaking down and people selling their own people into slavery and armed groups coming in and mercenaries and all that type of. So we see with this huge European, if you want to call it, caravan with the Portuguese and the colonial trade system, but it was centered in the port of Luanda, and it fed the South American, especially the South America, where most of the slaves actually went to the Caribbean or to the South America, especially Brazil. They fed this slave route completely, and so there were three peoples, right? And there were three protectors within each of those groups. There were three protectors, and then there were three groups of traders as well. So three trade routes already moving before any choice was actually made. They started out one way, and then they got broken down by, of course, the influence of the traders and the pushing peoples around and the dynamics and the mercenaries and all those things disturbed what had been fairly traditionally safe for all three groups within the lands that they lived in. And the colonial system, in my opinion, has gone on till this day. I do not see, that's just me speaking as a Gentile. I do not see Africa free at all right now. I see it just another form of the same type of thing going on. And even when I see some countries starting to try to get out, there's still other countries coming in to enslave in different ways, through whether maybe in the past it was mercenaries and actual guns, and now it's through finances and banks and other kinds of things. But for the African people that have suffered, the suffering has not been over yet, I'm afraid. But I want to bring this all back to Joseph, because I don't think that the story is supposed to end just with the terrible things that happened up until the 1850s and when the slave trade sort of fell apart with the changes in Europe and the changes in America and the changes elsewhere. So I think to come back to this story of Joseph, the family wasn't perfect, never was. Just look at them. The family was not perfect. There was the Reuben group. There was the Judah and even his more angry brothers group. And then there was the Joseph group. So there's this group dynamics and of course the traders. And so this story has this effect. And in each of these communities, we can see the initial protection or the protection for some group or part of the group. So it wasn't just every man and his dog selling each other into slavery. Yes, there were groups that were and were not. But we see that there is this theme of the family, and then the family breakdown, and then the slavery and all that went into it. So it was never just one people that was perfectly the only people that were never into slavery and never did any slavery. You might say the Igbo people did maybe less of it, possibly, and were more affected by it, possibly, as a group for their size. But yet they still had their Judah type stuff going on and the traders and that going on. And then we can see the Yoruba people. Yes, they may started out protecting their own people, but more like the Judah people with others. And then we see the Congo and the Bantu people. Yes, protecting their own family and that, not doing what was done to Joseph, but selling anybody else that was not part of that into the Midian trade. and then the breakdown, and then the same collapse. So like I said, the blame game is difficult. Yes, there may be a little more blame here, a little more blame there, and there's blame on everything, especially the colonial powers, because without the slave traders, there wouldn't have been the slavery in that same way, of course. Although slavery was common in Africa, even back into the Bible time. I want to go back to the reunion of Joseph and his brothers, because of course it's not tidy, it's not perfect, there was some trickery and stuff going on there. But look at the moment and look what happened. So when Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers, the text says that he could not refrain himself. He wept for his family. He wept to meet his younger brother he'd never known. In front of everyone standing there, he wept. He has to clear the entire room before he does that. Why? Because he has a position in the kingdom. Plus he wants his privacy, I suppose, too. But he wants to make that family connection. It's like if I was there and some Bantu and Igbo people were wanting to reconcile, it's best to kick the Gentile out of the room. Yeah, you go off and come back later, and that's okay. It's not offensive. There has to be, that family has to come back together first before you can deal with outsiders. So before Joseph could deal with the Pharaoh and his friends that were in Egypt, of which I'm sure he had many, he had to separate them apart so he could deal with his family in person. And like I said, he wept out loud. He fell on them, right? He was so overcome with joy to those that had been really his enemies. Family, but enemies. And I don't want to downgrade the hurt that Joseph had. He never saw his mother again. He didn't grow up with his brothers. He was tossed from his family. He went through terrible times with the slavery first. Then he just was getting up, the woman, Potiphar's wife, then into prison, then all the years in prison, then being forgotten, and then the dreams, yes, and all that. But it wasn't an easy life. It's what it says in the scriptures, refiner's fire. He went through it. And yet, you see the greatness of his heart, and probably why his father gave him the double portion. He, in the end, saves his family. Not just because he gave them some food, but in my opinion, because he reconciled with them. He brought them together as family again. So Jacob could die in peace without the fracture in the family. But I'm afraid that the fracture among my viewers that are from Yoruba or Igbo or Bantu, the fractures, they're still real. They're still there even after, almost 200 years. The fractures are still there and very bitter and very deep. And we see in the story, especially with Benjamin, that he just weeps to know his brother that he'd never known. But he weeps over all his brothers. And the cool thing is, at the end, he talks to them all. They sit together, they talk, they tell about what has happened. They're able to make that connection after, all those years. They're able to come back together as a family and the heart, but also to start to understand and start to come to knowledge and it'd be like if I were to take two friends, I had two friends, one Igbo and one Bantu, and you bring them into a room and they start to talk and I leave the room and they can then talk and start to go, okay, yeah, okay. And then maybe there can be some reconciliation, I think. Another point of the story with Joseph that we often forget, and I forget myself, is that after Jacob dies, the brothers then fear again that Joseph is going to come and do what they'd done to him. And they're really quite nervous and scared. And so they send Joseph a message and ask him, they send him a message begging for his forgiveness. And what happens with Joseph? He weeps again. He's already gone down that road, but they hadn't yet, in a sense, I suppose, forgiven themselves and come to terms with it. But the healing took years. Wasn't just that one meeting. It took years, but it did end up happening. Was it a perfect healing? I don't think so. Because we see in the scriptures there is huge animosity between Ephraim and Judah when the kingdom splits, right? That's like there was always some underlying family dynamics, no doubt. But at least they were able to come together as family. Coming back to what Joseph said, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. So Joseph, he doesn't say, you didn't do this. Okay, he doesn't say, no, that never happened. He says, you did do this, but God used it to bring salvation unto many. Salvation unto many. And I'm going to make a quick aside here. I see this among the awakening community so much. Anger, I get it, towards me and one of the Gentiles, and of course other peoples, Ham even. But think about it, the same thing. How did you get your scriptures back? It came through Ham, through the Cushites keeping the Ethiopian Bible, and through the Gentiles. As much bad as they did and as much destruction to the scriptures as they've done, they still came through the Gentiles back so that they're in the hands of the awakening people. So God can use, or the Father can use, many peoples in many ways to bring about much good, as he did in this story. And that doesn't mean that what the colonial traders did and are still doing doesn't make it right, and they'll have to deal with Heavenly Father on those issues, absolutely. But it does mean that we can start to look back and go, okay, I get it, so let's move on. Just like Joseph wept and moved on. And though they weren't sure that he had moved on, he had moved on and never turned his back on them ever at all. So whoever your or my ancestors were, they're not really part of this story, I suppose, but let's say they were. Let's say my family really was into the colonial trader system, which they weren't, but if they were, still, if we could get together and look at not which group sold who and who sold that, yes, those all happened, and yes, those people will have an accounting to give with Father in heaven, but we aren't there anymore. So all of us have, skeletons in the closet. But I think among the Yoruba, Bantu, and Igbo people, there are groups that were the protector, okay, like Reuben was. There are some that were the traders, like Judah and his brothers. There were some that were the captive, like Joseph, and were sold over to the Americas and other places. And some were all three, okay? And I think, like I said, some of my viewers have said, yes, I've got this and this and this in my heritage. It's just fascinating how, those things could all be mixed up together now, and how Heavenly Father uses time to change things and change attitudes and opinions, because the person that is now Igbo and Bantu mixed, or Bantu and Yoruba mixed, or all three mixed, they aren't fighting within their own self about themselves. They're going, I have three different heritages. I have some skeletons in the closet, and I have some greatness in the closet too. And that's probably true for every one of us living here on earth. So whatever your ancestors did, or even part of your ancestors, or even a tenth of your ancestors, or mine, whatever they did, it's for us to be generous and to be kind and put it, as it says in the scriptures, put that in the Father's hands. And for us to move on. For my African friends, I am hoping that you can come together one day as a people. It doesn't mean you have to be all the same, but that you can come to oneness within Africa, and you can be one with the people of Ham and the people of in South Africa, the Khoisu, I think they're called, or Pygmies, as some other people call different peoples, or the Maasai, or the Zulus, or the Bantus, and the Igbo, and the Yoruba. Instead of all these titles and all these things, yes, keep our culture, keep our language, actually enforce them, get them better, strengthen those things with your children, and bring back the heritage that the colonial powers tried to take away, yes. But also remember, part of the colonial power thing was to divide. To conquer was to divide. And to get rid of the divisions is, I think, only can happen from within Africa, within your own people, as you decide, like Joseph did, to go, yeah, you did do these things to us, or your people did these things to us. These things happened. But it all worked out for good. Look what God, or look what the Father has done with us all, and where we are now in the great scheme of things as the last days are coming on. What has the Father really been doing with all our failings and our Father's failings and our Father's greatness? What has he been able to do? I hope that you can really dig into that and enjoy it. I have started a Patreon. I'm going to leave a link here, and anybody that feels that they can help with the channel, I sure would appreciate it. If you do want to enjoy the videos, I've had a few people ask about the amount of ads on the videos. If you want to join there, I think it's like $5 or something. You want to help with the work I'm trying to do. I'd like to see the African peoples start to heal and start to take back their countries from the colonial powers that rule through people that are in their own countries. I don't mean through overthrowing governments and that kind of thing, but I mean through taking back the heart of who people are. Because if the whole community can come back to oneness and who they are and to the strength of who they are, then the shackles will break. But as long as we're fighting with one another and angry with one another and thinking about all the past grievances that happened, I mean, that's what the colonial powers do. You go back to anywhere in Europe, they have grievances back thousands of years. And I don't see that in my African friends. I see much more kindness and merciful behavior than I see among the Europeans or Japheth. But be that as it may, it's there in all peoples, all peoples of the earth. Some have it more and some have it less. Here's a video I just finished that I think you'd enjoy. And take care. I really hope you enjoyed it and have a good day. Take care. Bye-bye.